The aim of tonight's two presentations and the panel discussion to follow is to get to know our panelists. We have Lindsey Bond and Heather Magusin tonight, and the projects they've been working on as recent MA graduates. We'll get to hear a little bit more about that. And we'll be paying special attention to the role of the camera as photographic images and their overall practices, as well as thinking about the themes of land and memory using an organic conversational approach. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our first artist who'll be presenting, Lindsey Bond. Lindsey is an intermediate artist mother born in Amiskwacy, Wisconsin, which is Beaver Hills House or Edmonton. Using slow textile and photographic processes, she intervenes in her white settler family archive to think through her responsibility as a mother and settler descendant to remember and sow a relationship with the earth. Lindsey recently defended her MFA thesis, Ecosystems of Inheritance, at the University of Alberta. She also received her BFA in photography from Emily Carr University of Art and Design and studied visual communications at Edinburgh College of Art in Scotland. Her artwork has been exhibited in the TREX program, Gallery 44, MAWA, and the Richmond International Film and Media Arts Festival. And so with that, I'm really excited to have you with us, Lindsey, and to learn about your artistic practice. So with that, I'm just gonna pass on screen sharing capabilities to you. So just give me a moment. Should be all set for you.
Thanks so much, Ashley. That's awesome. Okay. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah, getting some head nods. Okay, awesome. Okay, thanks for giving me a minute there to get settled. Thank you so much to Ashley and Genevieve for inviting me to speak and be on the panel today. I was just thinking, I remember being in my first year at ACAD and learning about the Exposure Photography Festival, and now I get to be on this panel with Heather, and I'm just really excited and honored to be here, so thank you so much. I'm joining you from my dining room office studio, so you might sort of hear my family kind of coming in and out of the audio a little bit, so I hope you're okay with that. I'm okay with that. And my home is in Amiskwacy, Wisconsin, in Edmonton in Treaty 6 territory. And my family and I continue to learn about this place as a traditional gathering place for many Indigenous nations, including the Nehiyawak, the Blackfoot, Métis, Assiniboine, Dene, and Inuit, among many others. I acknowledge my family's privilege of being able to call this place home and to create my MFA thesis here. So I just also like to quickly thank my family who are a part of this work, and then my supervisors, Tanya Harnett and Marilyn Oliver. And I'd also like to say Nanaskamun to Elder Dale Saddleback, who's from Samson Cree First Nation, as well as Dr. Donald Papachase Cree, who have all guided and supported this work. So as part of creating an ethical artistic practice, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself and my family. So I'm descended from Scottish MacLean, English Reynolds Bond, and German Wyke Hoffman families who took part in settling and farming in Treaty 6 around Lone Rock and 7 territory in Okotoks. So both sides of my family actually lived in places that were named for rocks. So Okotoks meaning Big Stone in Blackfoot, and Lone Rock is the name that the settlers gave the area based around a buffalo rubbing stone. So stones have come kind of in and out of my work over the years, and they're really important to me. I situate myself also as a white settler intermediate artist mother, and specifically in this project, granddaughter and niece. And so when I talk about myself as mother, I refer to myself being in positioned in this work through a state of collective production. So I find myself undertaking artistic responsibilities as well as domestic and emotional labor in making this work with my son. So in 2018, I inherited my late grandmother's my photographs and negatives dated years, 1801 to 19. Archive and was of visiting with memory is a series of photos and pictures, in addition to handmade wallpaper that works to remember and restory agrarian narratives from my family's Red Rose Teton archive alongside the Battle River. So this work was made at the onset. Oh, I'm seeing an admin button there. This work was made at the onset of my MFA degree and represents an early exploration into working with my archival family photographs and visiting the place the archive points to with my son. So working with my family archive has been rewarding, but also challenging because it's made me realize how little I knew about my family history. I had never been to the Battle River or Lone Rock, and I grew up kind of hearing a very simple story, that of my grandfather coming from England, marrying, a nice Canadian girl named Dorothy, and they homesteaded near Lloydminster. So this story really pushed me in a number of different ways, coming from kind of this narrative deficit and pushing me to learn a lot more about my family stories and where they're located. These are my two aunts, and my Aunt Betty on the left passed down the Red Rose Teton to me. And so I began working through an autoethnographic framework to engage with my aunts and learn our family stories. So my son and I visited my aunts in their kitchen before COVID, and they began telling us stories based on the photographs. So this reminded me of Martha Langford's work describing the performance work of photography and telling us, that talking about the photographs, the stories, in telling the stories about the photographs is how we actually understand the fabric of memory. In our discussions, I was reminded how important it is to remember what is in the archive, but also that we have a responsibility to the place where the archive comes from. So in our visits, they helped me realize that caring for the family stories involves asking some hard questions, such as what is not in the family archive. One photograph from the archive that stuck with me pictures my grandma Dorothy swimming in the Battle River with my great aunt Beatrice near the Unwin Bridge. So over the course of 8 seasons, my family and I traveled between our home and the Battle River and witnessed the river as giver of life and a natural boundary. So we began these visits by visiting the same place where my grandmother swam, right near the Unwin Bridge. And we began observing how the coulee area and the river had changed from the original photograph. We also witnessed what is not in the archive. So we witnessed many oil silos, the legacy of the oil industry in the area, and many large-scale wheat and canola farms. So our first visit to Lone Rock, we were quite shocked to witness a buffalo rubbing stone made as pioneer monument. And so this comes also as a legacy from the area that is not included in the archive. And so the plaques over top of the stone tell 2 stories. So one is a buffalo rubbing stone, and the other monumentalizes settler pioneers of Lone Rock. There are 2 stories that are written here, but only the settler story is acknowledged, and the buffalo rubbing stone is cemented over. So experiencing these things, I had to ask myself, how do I, as a settler descendant, begin to work in a relational way with stones? So when I began my degree, I intended on reshaping my family archive with, with organic kind of womb-like shapes. I began trying to create clay shapes based from memories of a dream that I had, and I came up with these really simple rock-like shapes. So I paused and sort of reflected and was like, well, why do I need to recreate what Mother Earth has already created? So it began the very long process of learning how to make molds with stones. So in the studio, I began to move some river rocks from the North Saskatchewan River to my studio to begin the mold making process. And so I think as artists, it's important to recognize where we make mistakes and where we can learn from those mistakes. So my supervisor, Tanya Harnett, was very kind in helping me realize that maybe moving the stones is a process that needs to be, rethought. And so I began to kind of unpack this moving of stones and, potentially this physical embodiment of my settler colonial inheritance, and really thinking back to actually what is my experience with stones. And, it really does kind of center around more of an agrarian perspective of moving stones out of farm fields. So I became aware that I needed to learn how to acknowledge the relationships between the stones and Mother Earth here in Treaty 6, specifically acknowledging Nehiyaw knowledges that have been here since time immemorial. So I began to meet with Elder Dale Saddleback, and we discussed the buffalo rubbing stone, how it was moved from its original home to Lone Rock. And I spoke to him about wanting to acknowledge the erased histories and begin the repair work. So Elder Dale was very generous, and he shared his knowledge about stones with me, and I'll share it with you. So he said the gifts, and I have his permission to share. So he said the gifts of stones is that they remain in one place for a long time, and that we as humans need to take a bit more consideration in what we pick up and move around. He also shared that from a Nehiyaw perspective, stones are understood as grandfathers and the oldest knowledge keepers in this place. And so we took his words to heart, and we began to actually move to the riverbank to make the molds as we would work and move. As I went to my aunts and to my grandparents to learn these stories, we began to work beside the riverbank in that same way. So working from molds, I brought the molds back to the university, and I made casts based on the molds in a vacuum former, working with recycled and later plant-based plastics. The photo sculptures were the result of the work. The introduction of light creates a lot of reflections and refractions that end up disturbing the image. And so I began to become aware of how light entered and exited the sculpture on its own as an active participant. And it was this very beautiful, alluring effect. And it kind of brought the photograph back down to its basic components of water and light. And so in this project, I began actually bringing the photo sculptures with us on our visits, and I began to document them in the places where the original pictures were first pictured. So I chose to include the rivers and stones and plants as an attempt to visualize a dialogue between what is the very recent settler memory and older place-based knowledges. The photographic series began to hold this uncomfortable tension for me. In the process of visiting and documenting the photo sculptures, I had to ask myself, do the photo sculptures reinsert my family stories back into the land, sort of in that same way that the pioneers were memorialized, or do they offer a space for critical consciousness, where the images can shift into artifacts that help us contemplate our relationship to place? So something that I still kind of am thinking through and grappling with. During this time, I was also thinking through the legacy that I was making for my son. So here we see the image of Theo standing in the field near our old home, our old family homestead. And his feet are pictured near a salt lick, prairie sage, mixed grasses, and cow dung. It's a very intentional decision to include him in the photograph as a way to shift the archive to include how he is now connecting to this place and as we move forward. So it's important, I wanted to note that beside the river, Theo and I engaged in this really beautiful sort of intergenerational memory work. And it was really inspired by Theo's natural inclination to play. So Theo's play connected us with the mud, the water, the plants. We were, in direct contact with place without any motives of seeing or recording. We're just being with place. And this helped me to really step back as a photographer and as a researcher and artist, and just be with this place and learn about it through curiosity. So we began playing with the sculptures instead of taking them so seriously. So we took them off the photo bases and we ended up holding them up. And Theo first looked through it, almost like looking through a lens, so looking through like a stone lens. And so we began photographing our play in that way. And so this inspired a visual shift in the project to think through memory and legacy. In the final iteration of the photo sculptures presented in my MFA thesis exhibition in last November, the photo sculptures shifted to center our growing relationships around the plants beside the Battle River. The plants became the family that we visited on a regular basis. We learned their names and their roles in the ecosystem, how they would hold up the riverbank hold the riverbank together, despite the fracking and the farming. So finally, in our visits, in the last year of my degree, we actually located the home of the buffalo rubbing stone. So here we actually observed the shape of animals' dens in the canola field, and we began to put some connections together. And we understood that actually this is where the buffalo rubbing stone once lived, and also where its buffalo descendants had made wallows. And so the animals, we were guessing they're coyotes or moose, had made their dens in the same areas where the buffalo used to make their wallows. And so the shape now that's left, it really speaks to the animal's memory of this place. And so the images combined together at the end of the exhibition really speaks to this intersectional memory. So my inheritance, as well as these many intersectional stories. And yeah, I think that's where I'll leave it for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Definitely a very compact presentation of a very rich and in-depth look into your work. So thank you for that. I'm going to just introduce Heather Magusin now, and we'll have time afterward for some pre-prepared questions that we've put together, and then we'll jump into some of the questions that I'm sure you all have. But first, I'd like to give a welcome to Heather Magusin, who is a photographer, poet, and cyclist born and raised in the beautiful and often hostile lands of northern Alberta. When she picked up a camera over 15 years ago, it was this rich clash of the natural and human worlds of her home province she sought to capture. Recent projects continue to follow these questions of human-natural conflict and juxtaposition, including a photo essay on climate change in the Yukon published in Briar Patch magazine and several volumes of poetry. Currently, her time is spent photographing and researching the contemporary relationship between humans, plants, and wildfire in Western Canada. So thank you for being here, Heather. I believe Lindsay will have passed on screen sharing to you.
Hi, thanks everyone so much for being here. It's such a privilege to be able to chat with everyone about my photos. And thank you so much, Lindsay, for sharing your incredible art with you that has such a personal connection between you, your family, the land. It was really inspiring to watch that. So I'm glad that that got to kick off our talk together. Let's see if I can share my screen with everyone. All right, so there was already an introduction of who I am, but I'd like to also add that I'm not a professional artist, and my master's thesis was not on photography. This is more of a sort of experiential passion project for me. So I hope this offers a sort of interesting juxtaposition to Lindsay's work. I'll be chatting with you about my exhibit Carbon, which is traveling through northern Alberta right now. So I took these photos in the summer of 2020 when I was on a leave of absence from my master's degree, and I was bike touring from Alberta to BC with my friend Sarah, who you can see in this photo here. And at the time, my master's thesis was on the cultural politics of wildfire in northern Alberta, and I was also a research assistant on another project called Living with Wildfire, which was situated in the Okanagan. So fire was definitely on my mind, but I did not set out to take these photos initially. I just sort of brought my camera along with me on this bike tour, and because of the relationship between fire and the land in Western Canada, it was sort of inevitable that I would stumble upon these burn sites that I ended up photographing. So the photos in the exhibit Carbon are all taken from the Excelsior fire, which burned near Medicine Lake, so near Jasper in 2015. And when we got to this burn site, it was late August. There had just been a snowfall. The sun was shining through spectacularly. There's an incredible contrast between the fireweed and the sort of charred stumps that were laying on the ground. And I was so delighted that I just grabbed my camera and traipsed off into the forest for an hour and explored around. So from that, you can probably get an idea of my photographic practice. It's very spontaneous, sort of thoughtless, but in a playful way, very experiential. And that's sort of thematic with this work, where I really hope that these photographs sort of capture the delight and the really physical, visceral experience of being in those moments, of being in those burn sites, rather than any situation that's more manicured or I guess more set up. And if you're curious, I shoot on a Nikon D7100, which is a crop sensor camera, and some really crappy lenses. And this is my bike touring setup. I do not recommend it to anyone. It's very back heavy. But my camera and all my camera gear are shoved in there. So no tripod, no filters, no flash, just pure me and my little crop sensor camera running around in the woods. So after taking these photos, finishing my bike tour, I curated a few of them, edited them, had them framed and printed, and this exhibit started taking shape. And the impetus for this series was the desire to challenge or to add nuance to the dominant conception of wildfire that we have. I'm sure many of you have a personal relationship to fire, especially if you live in Alberta and BC. And it probably holds some negative emotions to you. You probably associate it with disaster or tragedy or loss. And lately it's even come to be this global symbol of climate apocalypse, where all of these mega fires worldwide seem to be like harbingers of our dystopian future. And this demonization of fire, its symbol in this manner, actually has a really long history that's rooted in colonial and capitalist ideologies. So initially, when settlers came to Western Canada, fire was a threat to the livelihood of farms and permanent settlements that were dependent on private property. And later, it threatened the timber industry. So to save these colonial and capitalist assets from fire, the forestry industry and colonial powers started a war on fire that had tactics that ranged from banning traditional Indigenous burning practices to releasing war-inspired propaganda, like the posters you see here. And on the right-hand side, you'll see the Canadian counterpart to Smokey the Bear, known as Birdie the Beaver. So you might be asking yourselves, especially after that quite playful Birdie the Beaver photo, what's so bad about stopping fires from destroying homes and farms and forests? What's so untrue about these depictions? And it's not that they're untrue, of course, it's just that they're very incomplete conceptions of fire. It's such an ingrained colonial and capitalist perspective of fire that really omits the ecological and cultural necessity on our landscape. Luckily, Western science is catching up to the Indigenous understanding of fire as a necessary process. And the best way to explain this process is through the concept of adaptive cycles. Basically, this is just a way to explain the process of the cycling of nutrients or the cycling of material in ecosystems. So this occurs in all processes in all ecosystems throughout the world. Basically, it's got 4 stages, the first being growth. So if you've been to a fresh wildfire burn site, maybe in Waterton, you know that as sort of like the wildflowers that just push up through, and maybe just like baby conifers coming through. That would be the process of growth. So just like the initial first colonizing species. Next would be maturity. And this happens when the sort of the final ecosystem takes shape, everything is mature, the biomass is there, and you can think of this as like maybe a mature conifer forest. Following that is collapse. And in our example, of course, this is fire. So this is when some sort of catastrophic event goes through releases all of that material, releases all of that nutrients, and the ecosystem that had been there is removed or destroyed in part. And finally, there's renewal, where you get whatever species, either the same as the ones that were before or new ones that recolonize these landscapes. And without this process of collapse, without the thing that we see as destruction, this ecological process wouldn't function, because all of those materials, all of those nutrients would be stuck in those mature organisms. So I'm going to quote Nancy Turner here because she's one of my favorite researchers and an incredible ethnobotanist that I love and admire. And she says here that it's ironic that the landscapes so appreciated by early explorers and colonists actually were created by the fires they feared and disliked. And I'm just going to say that one more time. It's ironic that the landscapes, these beautiful, pristine, untouched forests that we so fear being affected by fire and destroyed by it, were actually created by fire. And so Carbon, this exhibit, is my attempt to try to capture that idea, to capture the natural process and put forth a more nuanced, ecological, and anti-colonial understanding of fire. And visually, it's a lot about juxtaposition. In these photos, I'm contrasting charred and fallen trees with bright new growth, bleak skies with the audacious flowers, orange moss, as you see here, with the idea of fire, berries as a sign of abundance, amid the seeming devastation, and these sort of classic picturesque vistas contrasted with the snarled bird trees in the foreground. So the main thing, when you look at these photos, it's not immediately apparent. They may just seem sort of like postcard pictures, but you're not just meant to look at what seems to be a pretty picture. It's not weird and unsettling and thought-provoking on its own. So maybe it's a bit paternalistic of me, and it's certainly the antithesis of the traditional artistic method, but I sort of want to guide and teach as well. So to pair these photos with that ecological understanding, with that historical understanding of our perception of fire, and how it came to be. I know it's not the usual tactic of the visual arts, but my hope is that this provokes a conversation, even if it starts with a statement rather than a question. So I'll just reiterate a bit of my artist statement to you. So I guess after 2 years of research in my master's thesis and these photo journeys across Alberta and BC, I've come to see Alberta's natural ecosystems and its oil and gas industry not as irreconcilable, but as different expressions of a similar millennia-old process, which is the creative destruction through fire. Carbon, this exhibit, is the visual coalescence of these three things: the oil dependence of my Alberta hometown of Grand Prairie, the beauty of the Boreal Forest, and the increasingly threatening and badly misunderstood reality of wildfire. And it's also an attempt at reconciling these things, to heal the metabolic rift, if I can quote some Marx, between our limited understanding of fire and its reality on the land we call home. So ultimately, these metaphorical and visual parallels show that fire, the forest, and our fossil fuel dependent lives aren't at odds, but rather they're part of the necessary and inevitable cycling of carbon. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Heather. Again, so it's really amazing to hear you talk about your work. It's another very condensed explanation of this wonderful exhibition and series. I am going to link both of your TREX exhibition catalogs in the chat for everybody. Just if you're interested, you can go and take a look at those. They have the full list of images and additional content if you're interested. But that aside, I think we'll jump into our panel discussion. And I'm just gonna ask a few questions that will relate to both of your practices. When we sort of began thinking about this panel, we saw the connection between land and memory in both of your series, how the land holds memory in terms of fires holding memory, and then continuing that process that you've talked about, as well as these family memories that you're placing on the land and finding stories that you want to unpack. So maybe as a first question, we can talk about your master's experience in your education, and if you had any mentors or how that shaped your exploration into these topics. Either of you can jump in if you want.
Heather, you want to go first?
So sorry, would you mind summarizing the question again? Was it about?
Yeah, sure, sorry. Were there any mentors or specific experiences during your master's program that kind of spurred into these series, or were they separate? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was really lucky to work as a research assistant on the project called Living with Wildfire, like I mentioned before, which was an incredible cross-disciplinary research project to better understand how people in the Okanagan were coexisting with wildfire and what a future of more mutualistic coexistence rather than a sort of hostile coexistence with fire in the Okanagan might look like. So I started working on that first before I started working on my thesis, and being with Greg Gerard, who was one of my co-supervisors and an incredible eco-critic, was very inspiring. He deals with basically the influence of literature on our perception of the environment. Very poetic, very intelligent, and that was a huge inspiration for this. And I also got to work alongside and go on some photo walks with Andreas Rutkaukas. I cannot pronounce his last name correctly, but he's also another photographer and professor out of UBC who photographs wildfire. And he does these really incredible large format landscapes of the aftermath of fire similarly, but oftentimes incorporating more human elements into them, and they are sort of more like these grand sweeping vistas. So I was definitely surrounded by an environment, since I was in Kelowna at the time, that was very conducive to thinking about land and fire and our relationship to it, and very inspired by the other faculty I was working with.
Thanks so much, Heather, for sharing your work. It's so nice to hear you speak about it. So during my MFA, I have to say that my supervisors, Tanya Harnett and Marilyn Oliver, were really supportive sort of in my journey. And I began working, I had come from a photo-based practice. And so I really, the MFA kind of gave me the time and space to push forward more into an intermediate practice. So working more between video, photo sculpture, and textiles. So I use sort of all these different methods to situate my family stories in relationship with Treaty 6 and further contextualize the stories, more specifically through a critical white settler research and digital textile processes. So I'm trying to think of a few scholars who were really important to this work. So in the beginning, I kind of went back to more of my photo theory. So working through like Martha Langford, Marianne Hirsch, and really taking to heart what they had to say about looking back into the archive. And so I found myself, working between really needing to understand sort of ethically how to look back. It comes with a privilege to be able to look back into it. So working a lot with their work. But then moving forward, I had to learn how to sort of unlearn, I guess, like where I'm positioned. And so a lot of that work was inspired by critical settler Dr. Leah Decter. And so reading, she shared her thesis with me, and we had a few different conversations, and it really helped me understand and be able to articulate where I was. And also, I would say working with one of my first Native Studies teacher, his work, Dr. Dallas Hunt, his work really helped inspire me also to take up this call to action, where settlers he asked settlers to look back into their family archive and think through the stories. So often settlers will try to incorporate Indigenous stories into the archive, like, oh sorry, we erased them and forgot them, sorry, we're just going to include them now. And so instead of doing that, he asked people to really think about the settler stories through the lens or framework of older stories that are in this place. So I really took that to heart as well. And then in sort of the current milieu of working in a Amiskwaciy, Waskagan, working with Dr. Dwayne Donald and his work around ethical relationality, as well as very fortunate to work with Elder Dale Saddleback, as well as a few other folks who are really important. So anyways, I could go on and on, but yeah, those are kind of the people who are really important to the research.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anyone that's listening that isn't sure where to start in some of those areas of wanting to explore your own histories, but also trying to understand the even older histories, there's so many resources, and I'm sure either of these artists would be happy to, provide some books or recommendations for people to start if anyone was interested. But that's so much to unpack in this short time, but I'm really excited to hear about your work and how you're doing this. I wanted to ask, how do you navigate some of the colonial histories of photography, and do those contexts influence your current practice, and how?
I wanted to riff off of Heather's presentation for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I actually have never seen those posters with the beaver, and just thinking about this question, I brought me back. So like in my family archive, I think a lot about the geological surveys, the CNR posters, the government ads, settler propaganda, bringing the settlers to Canada. And I just feel like those probably were made right around the same time. They look really similar, just as harmful. And so I guess, I think about photography by and large as a colonial process of capturing light, holding still, but specifically capturing those certain views and perspectives that were established by those early, visual building blocks. And I guess in my family archive, I ended up noticing a lot of overlap where the same visual building blocks of those ads were actually built into the photographs in my family archive. So for example, I don't know if anyone is familiar with like the Canadian West, I think it's called Canadian West magazine. And so it would have slogans like the last best West, or, the right land for the right man kind of idea. And so one of the images actually has a woman, white woman holding a male child in front of, what seems to be a very successful, kind of perfect farm with the farmhouse and the barn and everything. And I just found this image sort of repeated through my family album. And so I feel like it's just super intertwined. There's no sort of getting away from it. And in fact, it's important to reveal that is actually where it comes from. And so anyways, I just wanted to pass it back to Heather, but those posters were super interesting to see in your presentation.
Yeah, and I really like, Lindsay, that you mentioned that there's no getting away from it, because it is often a struggle when you are using sort of a medium or a tool that was complicit in the oppression of the people and of the land that you're trying to reconcile yourself and your practice with. So it's really funny that the whole point of my exhibit is really to challenge that dominant colonial and capitalist narrative of fire, to challenge those images of fire as something huge and blazing and destructive and apocalyptic. But I'm using photos to do that. And I guess it's sort of the tragedy in many situations where it's important to acknowledge that we're doing the best we can with our colonial tools, and that sometimes it is useful to use that tool reflexively or as reflexively as possible to add an alternate healing narrative, which is sort of what I think both of our works are attempting to do. I have no further advice on this. I think it's something that all settler artists struggle with, unfortunately.
I think, yeah, I think it's absolutely an ongoing conversation, an ongoing and evolving process, just like you've just talked about, like an adaptive cycle, right? Where we have to learn and grow from the tools that we have at our disposal, right? So that's really great. Thank you both. Maybe we can explore how maybe where did you begin focusing on themes of land and memory? Did that begin during your master's, or were you interested in those topics before? Is that just something that's like always been part of your interest, is like understanding nature more?
Yeah, so I guess memory is less of a deliberate subject, but land certainly has always been a part of my photographic practice. I guess when I first picked up a camera, the things I started photographing were my mother's flowers in her flower garden, and then the other natural landscapes of the northern boreal that I wandered around through when I was growing up. So I've always been really interested, because I was so privileged in having this sort of very natural connection to the land, in using my photography to attempt to bring that same close inspection of nature and connection to nature to others. And I think that's only really grown as I've traveled further, as I've deepened my academic practice with my relationship to land, where, yeah, I'm sort of constantly just troubling that perspective. What is our relationship to it? What are we missing? What aren't we seeing? How is the land trying to communicate to us, especially with like wildfire burn sites? How can we learn the language of the forest through its visual communication to us? All of that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about your question some more, and I feel like I feel like I've been working with memory in place for a long time, but in different ways. So I remember, I can remember when I was in my undergrad, earlier work, I worked with, really trying to understand, I guess, like time and place and memory and how they work together. But I used, a lot of overlapping exposures, multiple exposures, to try to express that relationship. And so I think, looking back, it was very worthwhile and very interesting, imagery, different types of imagery that resulted, and some was more successful than others, I think. I think I definitely struggled with, I guess, this inherent nostalgia that would sort of come out of that imagery. And yeah, like from that nostalgia, there would be like light shapes and kind of, overlapping horizons and different, different types of imagery, but I felt like it wasn't specific enough. And so in this work, so in this next iteration, or next body of work that I see, I really tried to sort of hone down and ground my work in a lot more specifics. And I think in pushing myself to get more specific, by like specifically, there's too many specifics, by working, with my actual family stories in a specific place rather than being in between places, it's really helped me to actually identify, those, harmful nation building visuals. It's enabled me to actually connect with, ask those questions. What has been erased? What is in the archive? What isn't in the archive? And then really kind of understand a lot of where the intersections and entanglements are. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we have just over 10 minutes left. I think I want to open up the questions to the audience. So if anyone has questions, feel free to either add them in the chat and I can ask them, or if you are brave and want to just unmute and ask, you're welcome to do that as well. Are there any burning questions? If not, I have some more questions that I've prepared that we can chat about, but feel free to, you can also use the reactions and raise your hand if you want to be
Now
extra
I'm
polite.
disappointed that we haven't been thought-provoking enough, or maybe I'm
Burning questions. Yeah, that was an unintended pun. We have a question from Genevieve. Lindsey, can you chat a bit about the square format of the photograph and how you've been thinking through that?
Thanks, Genevieve. So yeah, I've been, I think for a long time I've been observing how light can take form. So light can be reflected, it can be refracted, and the shapes that it can create actually aren't limited to the rectangle. So as an early undergrad, I was very frustrated with the rectangle and its colonial viewpoint. It has to be this rectangle, thank you Kodak for this legacy that really narrows down what light can actually do and be and is. And I think in the photo sculpture, it allowed me to shift out of the square and light could, come and go as it pleased. It could be that active participant that I believe it to be in this sort of photography relationship of us working with light. So in the photo sculptures is a really great example of how light, when viewed through a different lens can do many different things to photography. So light can actually break a photograph down into sort of these basic components of light and water, and it can actually degenerate or deconstruct a type of photograph. And this is really interesting to me, especially attempting to restory the image and move it into a different place. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that for now.
We have another question from Rocio. What books are both of you reading, and what is a book that has inspired you recently?
So I think the most inspirational book for my master's thesis and for this work was definitely Stephen Pine's Awful Splendor. And Stephen Fire is sort of the preeminent fire historian. Unfortunately, I think this book was written maybe initially in the early 2000s or initially researched then. So it's a bit out of date, but really it gives a spectacular historical account of the politics, ecological, and I guess social reality that social role that fire has played since the Ice Age. So since the Boreal Forest and everything started emerging from the ice sheets. That was really lovely to read. And I guess unrelated, I've been really enjoying Richard Van Camp's short stories. He is a Dene writer from the Northwest Territories, and I find that his method of storytelling and way of communicating subjects that deal with intense grief and trauma and environmental collapse are all so personal and touching that, despite often being quite hard to read, they also fill me with this warmth and hope. It's just, his writing is imbued with such a love for his fellow human beings and his land that, I don't know, it's just been really a joy in these times to read someone's writing who can deal with hard subject matters in a way that's still very uplifting.
Thanks, Heather, for mentioning those. Yeah, great titles. Holy smokes. Here I'm looking at peering in my library here because I'm such a multitask reader. So I'll start here and I'll move to there. But I mean, gosh. Okay, well, I think I have a number of books. But one of the ones that was really important to my research was Place in Research. Hope you can see that, by Eve Tuck and Marcia Mackenzie. And so, as a settler descendant, I'm really trying to understand, Indigenous research methodologies, and then how I position myself in relationship to them. Another really wonderful one that I came across was by Valerie Zink and Emily Eaton, specifically looking at the oil industry in Saskatchewan. It's called Fault Lines. And this one interviews families directly to discuss, the impact of oil in the area. And it's like really one of the only books that does this, where they, speak to, directly with farmers and families. So that's a really interesting one. The last couple ones, of course, Natalie Lovelace, How to Make Art at the End of the World. Again, really great recommendations, processes, really thinks through, research creation, and how we all work through that. And then I just recently got this one. So it's really inspiring as mother, reassembling motherhoods on radical care and collective art as feminist practices. So this one has also been really inspiring. And I do want to mention one other one, Storying Violence, by Gina Starblanket and Dr. Dallas Hunt. And I have it around here somewhere. It's probably upstairs, but that one is really fresh off the press. I think it's not even a year old. And that one also really, really important read.
Thank you both. There's a couple more questions we'll try to get to here. Troy asks, do you find that by undoing settler colonial conditioning, it allows more space to understand and appreciate Indigenous traditional ways of thinking and knowing?
I think I'll let Lindsey speak to this because we don't have a lot of time and she's certainly the expert on this.
I am no expert. I think it's for myself and my work, working through the unsettling process is combined with this unlearning process. And part of the unlearning process is learning how to make space for other knowledges. And that's, I feel like that's what helps us move into these decolonial actions, where we're actually, physically working with land, working like decolonial actions that are impacting community. And it takes, the unsettling work is kind of maybe unsettling. that is the colonial part of it, unsettling the colonial part, and then actually moving forward to work in relationship with other people and other communities, other knowledges. So I feel like it's kind of a big circle of constant learning. But absolutely, I think once we make space, then we can definitely understand and appreciate, all many different types of Indigenous knowledges.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sierra asks, Heather, I see a lot of crossover metaphorical potential with the ideas of fire, destruction, regrowth relating to societal structures and colonialism. Is this something that you see personally as well? And if so, how do you address this?
That's a great observation and a great question. I have always been fascinated by applying the idea of adaptive cycles and just a lot of ecological concepts to societal structures. And my academic work focuses a bit more on capitalism than colonialism, though of course they're sort of inextricably intertwined. But we are sort of in a period where we seem a bit stuck. We seem a bit solidified and frozen in these archaic social and economic structures, where we would really benefit from this process of collapse, which I think in the social realm is often known as revolution. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, I think I, like a lot of the rest of us, were excited for this condition where things were so unsettled. It seemed like a shaking up of these inculcated structures and the possibility to build up something new from that base. And there's a lot of fantastic literature on social movements and revolution and sort of the preconditions of them that I guess ecological theory, like adaptive cycles, can't really explain. But I think in these processes, the intangible thing that's needed in human restructuring that's not really needed in environmental restructuring is one of imagination. So I think when it comes to reimagining a reality from the sort of capitalist colonial situation that we seem stuck in, there's just this paucity of ideas for what a different radical future could look like, and just like a poverty of potential futures that are outside of that box that we've created for ourselves, where we think reality can only be capitalist, can only be colonial. So yeah, I think that there's so much potential for crossing over these ideas of, yeah, destruction, regrowth, whatever. But there would probably be some wrangling around some other elements that might need to be brought in to fully explain it in a social realm.
That was very eloquently put, Heather. I definitely appreciate the sort of broad view of trying to remain imaginative and optimistic about some of these ideas. And yeah, very well said. And thank you both so much for your insights and sharing with us your work this evening. We just have a minute or so left. And yeah, you've left all of us with so much to think about. And it's been really lovely. So thank you both so much for your presentations this evening. And yeah, thank you to all of our attendees for listening this evening. And I suppose we will leave it at that, and we'll have lots to think about for the rest of the evening. Thank you so much.